Hi, everybody. Kiddo Tool here. I am the author of Songs We Were Singing, Guided Tours to the Beatles' Lesser Known Tracks, as well as Michael Jackson FAQ, All That's Left to Know About the King of Pop. I'm also the co-host of Talk More Talk, a solo Beatles video cast. You can also find me on Something Else Reviews, as well as Blinded by Sound, Cinema Centuries, Culture Sonar. You can't get away from me. So welcome. Sorry for the slightly late starting time. We were having some technical issues, but it's all good now. And I'm really excited to be doing this special edition of my monthly show because I have a very, very special guest. And before we get to that, let me just quickly mention a few things I'm working on, things to look out for. The latest Talk More Talk is now up on YouTube, iTunes, you name it. Every Podbean, iHeartRadio, everything. Oh, good. Everybody's tuning in. Excellent. Hello, everybody. So that is now up. So go ahead and go to your preferred place where you like to listen to your podcast. We had a great conversation about the influence of country music on the Beatles and in their solo years. I think you'll really enjoy it. I am also on a podcast called Friends of Dan, which is Dan Miles, who's a terrific interviewer. And I did an episode with Scott Erickson, your friend and mine, where we talk about the 50th anniversary of Abbey Road, and we go through the box set. Again, a lot of fun. Think you're really going to enjoy it. Hello, everybody. My goodness, everybody's really tuning in here. So that is up, and I will post all the links afterwards, after the show. So do listen to that. I will be on Tomorrow Never Knows, another podcast that we're taping on Friday, so that should be up next week. We're going to be talking about the anthology, so that should be a lot of fun. Culture Sonar, my next column in my series on R&B and its relationship to rock, will be up very shortly, probably again by next week. And right now, you can go over there and find my article about the original version of Hound Dog by Big Mama Thornton. So you can go check that out as well. And finally, Deep Beatles and Deep Soul are returning soon. I apologize for the delay ever since I got back from the Abbey Road conference, which was wonderful. But I really have had a hard time kicking this cold and all that. So, but I'm getting better. So those should be up hopefully by next week. So of course, stay tuned to my Facebook page, Twitter, and you'll see all the times that my stuff will be up. So, well, looks like we've got a good audience here. So let me introduce my special guest and my good friend. He is the author of this book right here that everybody is talking about. Here we go. That's a better view there. It's Solid State: The Story of Abbey Road and the End of the Beatles. You know him from numerous books that he's written on the Beatles, including Long and Winding Roads, the Beatles Encyclopedia, and he has also written a fantastic 2-volume biography of George Martin, the definitive biography. And he's also Dean of Humanities at Monmouth University. He is one busy guy, and I'm so glad that he is here to talk about his book, and we want you guys to be part of the conversation. So here he is, Ken Womack. Hi, Ken.
Hey, how you doing, kid? It's nice to see the queen of all Beatles media.
Well, you know, it's good to be the queen, you know. So well, we have got a good audience here that wants to talk to you and ask you questions, and of course, I've got questions of my own to ask you. And I'll tell you, this is really such an undertaking. I mean, you know, it's such a complicated story. because it seems like you're weaving all kinds of threads together. You've got technology, you've got of course, the creative process, you've got the tensions that were going on. How did you go into this project? I mean, that's a pretty daunting task to cover all of that.
I thought it would be much easier than it was, to be quite frank. You're absolutely right. I mean, it was definitely an issue in the sense that it's such a multi-part kind of story. You can't talk about one part without filling in something and reaching back just a little bit to set the stage. You can't get away with talking about Abbey Road without talking about the Get Back project. So narrative, in terms of narrative, it was a lot more complicated than I thought it would ever be. I thought it would be a simple little book, no, I really did. I thought it would just delve into the songs and talk about the mixing desk. I was wrong.
Yeah, I mean, that's what, and as always, you do such thorough research, and that's what truly, one of the many things that impressed me was just, how large an undertaking this really was. So, and let's start, because not everybody who's tuning in may be familiar with the term solid state. What does that mean? What does that have to do with Abbey Road?
Well, solid state refers to the very specifically to the TG12345. The mixing. It's just fun. It's fun to say.
It
and by
really
the way,
is.
It was it was an accident. I mean, it was just the next number in the sequence. It was not that they planned it that way. And the TG, for you Beatles nuts out there, which I guess is everybody, stood for the Gramophone Company. So that was, of course, EMI. And the mixing desk was installed after the Beatles finished the White Album. It allowed them to work with the existing 8-track deck and to mix with 8 channels. And of course, it had such great variability that they could manipulate each track separately. They could pan, fade, create echo, you name it. It just gave them quite a lot of versatility. But most importantly, it was solid state. So the red machines that they used before were tube equipment. And for the first time, they were working only in stereo with solid state electricity.
Yep. And I mean, you can really tell, even before I learned about all the different, and I'm sure everybody would say that, that before even you learn about the specifics of the technology, you just heard that album and it sounded so different from all of the others. I mean, it was, hard to explain, and you talk about that quite a bit. That's such an important aspect of the album.
Sure. It has a warmer, a brighter sound. So it is very different. I was giving a talk last night in North Jersey, and a fellow who stayed after used to work with Norman Normal or Hurricane Smith, depending on which nickname you want to use. And he was talking about how, folks like Jeff Emmerich had a real issue with the desk at first because it would cut off some of the highs and some of the lows. It didn't have the same kind of, sonic range that they were used to with the red desk. But of course, it brought so much more.
Yeah, it sure did. And you do an incredibly thorough job of going through just how different this was. But I wanted to mention, and by the way, everybody who's watching right now, if you have questions, feel free to ask, and we'll try to get to them, and as many as we can. I love that you started this book in the the very first title, An Unmitigated Disaster. Now that
which is not my phrase.
That is true. That's true. But that still takes guts, my friend.
It's a quote.
Yeah, it's a quote. It's a quote. And I'm sure most people, that phrase wouldn't really leap to mind when you're thinking of Abbey Road. So what does that, for those who have not read the book, and what does that mean? What does that refer to?
So it referred very specifically to one of the reviews of the album, which called it an unmitigated disaster. And much like Sgt. Pepper, there were a few outliers who really took issue with the record and didn't like this new Beatles they were hearing. And I kind of like that aspect of their story. They were always on the vanguard, right? And usually it was their own vanguard. George Martin and the Beatles, with their studio albums, would very self-consciously try to make it sound different than the last one.
Mm-hmm.
Hence, we have so many styles and generic changes that you can see with the Beatles, which makes them exciting. But, here we are sitting 50 plus years later, right?
Right.
And it's hard to remember the way that people would have received the albums in real time back in the 1960s, even for people who were there, right? Because when we look at them now, when we hear them now, we don't have that challenge. We're experiencing them very differently. But when you go back to those days, right, people weren't used to this new kind of sound. So while Jeff Emmerich, who is a great Grammy Award-winning engineer in 1969, if he's having trouble with the album, imagine what lay listeners were experiencing.
Yep, absolutely. And that really fascinated me, as I've been researching the album for various articles and so forth, that, it's amazing how, we think of it as it's a classic, and so many classic songs came from it. I mean, that the fact that it got mixed reviews. I mean, usually the medley got the best. I mean, from what I saw, and maybe, you saw some other stuff but the review got the medley got the best reviews, and that some of the others were considered, the tunes were boring, and I this is fascinating to me.
Oh, it is. And you're absolutely right. When you look at those reviews, and Rolling Stone commissioned 2 different reviews, to deal with this challenging situation. But, you have songs like Here Comes the Sun, Come Together in Something. Where's the boredom? I mean, they're amazing tracks. And yet it seemed like, for the most part, the medley was the part that people were able to accept.
Yeah, exactly. And maybe it was that reviewers were expecting kind of another Pepper, that Sgt. Pepper, that was such a, groundbreaking, obviously groundbreaking album. And it seems like Abbey Road is groundbreaking in its own way, certainly, as you talk about in the book, in terms of its sound. But I guess it just was maybe more subtle than their previous work. I don't know.
Probably so. In that chapter, right, when we're talking about Unmitigated Disaster, in that chapter, I talk about great literary works that had similar kinds of responses. The Great Gatsby, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ulysses, by James Joyce. These were works that were not initially understood. And, frankly, the Beatles are, the James Joyce and the F. Scott Fitzgerald for all time. So why wouldn't they have that same dis-ease of understanding, at least when they first come out?
Right, exactly. Yeah, it's
they're in great company.
Yes, that's right. And and we have hi Carol. She mentions that it got excellent reviews from the fans. Yeah, it did seem like the fans got it, immediately more than the critics did at the time. It's just fascinating to me. So let's talk about the relationship that was going on. I mean, with George Martin, they, of course, George agreed to work with them one more time, promising that they would work with him the way they used to, But you talk about quite a bit in the book that, they still the Beatles were experiencing tensions and distractions and all during the recording sessions. It's kind of amazing that they were able to put this together. So how do you, I mean, without going into too much detail, because it's all in the book, but what were these tensions and that were going on in the background as they were recording this album?
Well, there were several, of course, and what's interesting about that is that, while the Beatles make otherworldly music that, folks like the Queen there and me cherish and always will, right?
Yeah.
That just speaks to us on a very different level and a different plane of understanding. they're still real people. As I remind my students all the time, these are people who were going through traumas just like us. The Beatles had their own opioid crisis, right? I mean, it's funny in retrospect, but it's true. They were,
yeah.
and they were a created family, as small groups like that are, and they were dealing with one of their members dealing with those kinds of challenges. And it's, when you're a family and you're dealing with addiction, the stresses of that alone are enormous. Then you have this undertaking called Apple, which is spiraling out of control,
right,
and losing pots of money every week. And of course, they have no training to deal with that. The fellow that they counted on has been dead for more than 2 years.
right.
By the end of the Abbey Road sessions. So they're dealing with the movement toward a new manager, which is creating other kinds of tensions. And then you have just the generative stuff of growing up and growing older. People get married. People are having children. People are having difficulties in their relationships outside of the band. So the stressors only mount in real life. And that was the Beatles story. They were dealing very much with those kinds of, human problems.
Yep. Yeah. And again, that's what makes this story so fascinating, but so, complicated to tell. And you do such a great job. And particularly, I like how you mentioned how some of these tensions would, surface in the music at times. For example, when Paul McCartney, you talked about his anguished, screams and on in Helter Skelter, and how things like that, that would pour into the music and the itself.
Absolutely. Yeah, they're having real human reactions. The story, as we all have known for many, many years, the story of Paul working with Steve Miller, right, on My Dark Hour. It's no mistake that on that very difficult evening when the Beatles had a 3-1 breaking point, everybody against Paul, that Paul would live in that kind of anxiousness that was happening.
Exactly. It's just astounding that they, they produced this work when they were under, all this pressure. Now, you touched on this a bit in your George Martin biography, but, I think it's worth revisiting here. You talk about, as we mentioned, he only agreed to work with them if he said we can work the way, we used to. But did they really? How would you characterize their working relationship with George Martin during the making of Abbey Road?
Actually, I think they did exactly what he does say, which is to work together, and they worked well. I had an interesting conversation. I can't remember if you and I have talked about it recently with Alan Parsons, and something really hit me. He's the source of that one quotation about how the Beatles work separately and he never saw them together. And I kind of teased that out. We were waiting in a waiting room where people wait. And actually, it was kind of funny. We were at Sirius, and you could see the Sirius XM logo. And I said, "Hey, don't you think that probably came from your song?" And he said, "I bet that's right."
Yeah.
It's a funny moment. But in any event, where I was going is, this issue of working together, and this quote that's so often attributed to Alan. I asked him, I said, "Well, Alan, when did you start working on the album?" He said, "Well, I missed all the basic tracks." And he goes, "Well, obviously they were working on those together." So this one quote that has been circulated for 50 years or 40 something years really was spoken by a person who missed much of the first month of the sessions and came in to be the second engineer on the second half of the record. So of course he only saw that. So I do believe they worked well together. They're often all there in the studio. Of course, John Lennon, in addition to his other traumas that summer, had a very serious car accident.
Right.
And if anybody missed sessions, it was John. For good reason. He was up in a hospital recovering in Scotland.
Right.
So, there's no issue about that. But many of those basic tracks feature all 4 Beatles, or at least 3. So I do think George Martin was right about that. What I think he was wrong about, and I'm sure you and your listeners have all picked up on this, is he's saying that in the anthology many years later, when they know it's the last album, when they know that, the Beatles are not going to solve their problems and make a new record. In fact, the next record they will record is Free as a Bird. So, when George Martin says that in the early 1990s, it's a settled fact. This is nothing new. But it sounds poetic when you say, and we knew it would be our last album.
And funny that you bring that up, because Carol already asked this question, and so we might as well bring it up. As we all know, there was an interview that Mark Lewison did recently where he talked about the existence of this tape. It was a recording of a meeting at Apple, where and Ringo was not at the meeting. That's why it was recorded, and they were talking about possibly doing another album together, and that there was, this was all very dramatic about, this changes the story, that they all thought this was going to be the last, and that really, what do you make of this? How does it fit in?
Well, and I'm very happy to report that it is in my book.
Yes, it is.
It is included because it does happen. It's real. We've known about this since the 1970s. The first time I believe it was in print was in 1976 in One Day at a Time, the Anthony Fawcett book.
Right.
And then, and if I'm not mistaken, Nicholas Schaffner touches on it too in 1977 with the book we all love, The Beatles Forever, right?
Yeah.
It does in fact happen. It's not a new revelation necessarily, but it does have moments where they're working to consider, what do we do next? And it's interesting to hear how the tensions are skewing really towards George Harrison. And when you read the transcripts, you can see John Lennon even trying to throw sort of a bone to George to make sure he gets enough songs. And George says, well, you don't really play on my songs anyway. So, you could tell that there were other kinds of areas of concern there.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
I mean, obviously it does exist, and it did happen.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, and that's the thing. So, I mean, this was not exactly, I think the press kind of made it into this huge new revelation, which it's sort of, but
well, it was new to many people.
Yeah, it was.
It's not a huge talking point, but they had two meetings where all four Beatles were not present after Abbey Road, and they could not. They could not see their way forward at that point. And, obviously they gave it a shot. It's interesting when you think about this question and that they managed to make it that far, really, because at a certain point they are like great modernists like James Joyce, where they realize that what they're doing is very important. And you can see that, and they will say that, George Harrison, when he comes back in January 1969, heart of hearts, I should be here with you guys. There was this understanding that what they were doing was something very significant and very artistically important. And I really do think they held out as long as they can. Now, in terms of symmetry, it is kind of nice for people like you and me who want to think and talk about these albums 50 years later to say that their last song was called The End. And so it has a nice kind of it has a nice finish on it, right? Like a fine polish. So it makes them look very prescient in a sense, that they're sort of seeing into the future.
Exactly. Well, and we've got the benefit of hindsight. I mean,
absolutely. And let's face it, what we do know is the Beatles walking off the stage forever, in August 1969, gave them a mystique like very few other artists ever have had. It's almost encased in some special aura, because when they go away, it's forever.
Yep, that is true. That is true. And so, see, guys, this is really that's why you have to check out Ken's book, because it really goes through. This is such a complicated story. It's a fascinating story, but it's complicated. Now, you talk quite a bit, of course, about the technology. I mean, that became such an important part of the album, and one of just one part of it, other than we talked about the solid state console, but I also wanted to just mention the Moog. And the at the Rochester conference, I was told it is the Moog, it's not Moog.
It's definitely Moog, yeah.
Yes, and so that was one of many things that was great about that conference. At last,
it was a great conference for pronunciation.
It really was. It really was, and so now I'm fully confident in saying Moog. So
it's been fun these last few years as Beatles fans have learned how to say Moog and Escher.
Yeah, and Escher, that's right. That was the other. What Escher, Escher? We now have all these answers. So you talk about quite a bit about this in your book. What was the importance of the Moog to Abbey Road?
It is an important technological leap. They do great things with it. I think it's very useful that with the Moog, they don't overdo it. It was complicated to program. So that was a challenge. Alan Parsons has spoken about, the equal difficulties that they had making Dark Side of the Moon with some of the technology. In a way, the limitations of not being able to go hog wild with these electronic instruments was a benefit for bands like Pink Floyd a few years later and the Beatles, because they had to remain relatively simple, which has its own kind of beauty. Witness the solo in what is it? Because, for example, or the beautiful bits that George Harrison programs for Here Comes the Sun. But there is a truism here, and it's important. They would try anything that was new, right? So when the Hammond organ showed up in the studio, they wanted to use the Hammond organ. When they got those J160Es, they were playing the jumbos. When they had, when Paul got the Rickenbacker, he was playing the Rickenbacker. That's how it was. So when they'd have a new thing, they would get excited about it.
And they really, I just think it's fascinating how and you can really hear it in the remix. I think how much they did with the Moog, and I mean, even in subtle ways on certain tracks, and of course, I Want You, She's So Heavy. I mean, the way they use it, they really, but of course, I guess that was typical. They love to explore the boundaries or of technology.
Absolutely. And again, it was simply the novelty of it. They loved to try something new. I mean, you can almost see Paul and Ringo screwing around in that cabinet beneath the stairs, that prop closet in Studio 2, and finding the orchestral clap. And then, Ringo saying, well, we're going to put this on She Came In Through the Bathroom Window. I mean,
that was another thing I learned about at Rochester. Yeah, the orchestral clap. Yes, yeah. I remember that was great too.
Right,
yeah.
and that stuff is fun. But once they saw it, how could they not use it?
Yeah, exactly. It's just, it was too tempting. Yep, no kidding. So as I said, you cover so much in the book, and one of the things you cover as well is as the title suggests, the end of the Beatles, and you talk a bit about the Let It Be saga, which and particularly Phil Spector producing it. That I'm sure is a whole book in itself. So I mean, there's so much you could say about it, but I really was fascinated how you talked about just how George Martin and Phil Spector ended up kind of sniping at each other about the production, that Paul felt he was in kind of kept in the dark. So how do you think this this all played into the end of the Beatles? I mean, adding to the tension that was already there.
Well, I mean, it has to come up. And if you're going to talk about the end of the Beatles as a narrative, the production of the record that comes to be known as Let It Be, and the orchestration that Phil adds in 1970 is essential to that discussion, right? You can't not talk about it, because let's face it, there could have been other meetings if where they might have thought differently if some of these other nails in the coffin had not occurred. So you really can't get to the end of that story unless you talk about them. And this is where I meant when we started tonight, it gets more complicated.
Yes,
You
it
know,
does.
and of course, I never imagined I'm going to be talking about the McCartney album.
Yes, and that's the thing. I was going to mention that you even get into the beginning of their solo projects.
I really
about
had zero
music.
intention of doing that, but you get
You
to
kind
that.
of have to.
You really kind of have to, because of course there's a bleed in the sense that Paul's starting to make those tracks, right? All Things Must Pass is rolling in. And I have to say that it was very difficult to write that section of the book, because while I always enjoy digging into the recordings, because half the time you're playing them and listening to them,
Right.
when I got to the, referencing the tape and those meetings, et cetera, I really honestly got a little depressed, because it's a sad part of the story. You realize that you're writing about things from which there is no turning back. And it is truly sad.
Yep, and I also thought it was interesting how you mentioned, in addition to the solo projects, Ringo. I mean, trying to kind of what do I do now? What is my how am I going to transition now to a solo artist? And so you really get a sense of just how major a change this was going to be. I mean, in obvious ways.
Sure,
but
McCartney was depressed, right? He went into a depression.
Yeah, exactly. So it really, took their toll. So it's really, incredible. Let's take a few questions from viewers, because we're getting some things in here. So let's see. We've got one from Katie Jones. Hi, Katie.
Oh, Katie's good. I like her.
Yes, she is. She is awesome. And she says, I'll just read this aloud. That by Abbey Road's release date, many of us older teens were getting into heavy rock, and some considered the Beatles passé. I didn't, in parentheses. Those of us original fans who started with Beatlemania and grew up with the band were mostly thrilled with Abbey Road as a terrific mix of pop and heavier rock. So she asks, since it's now apparent that the Beatles did not consider Abbey Road to be the final album, do you think they would have gone in a more heavy rock direction, perhaps influenced by John, or do you think they would have continued in sort of a pop vein?
I'm going to borrow a page from our good friend Mark Lewison here. It's really tough to answer that question because we just don't know. And not only do we not know, but it just simply doesn't happen that way. But I think that's a smart question, as we would expect from a person like our friend Katie Jones. It is a smart question because, that kind of bone-crunching rock is in the air. Led Zeppelin 2, those are the albums of the day that are coming out very quickly. And there is a kind of a harder, edgier rock that's coming along when the Beatles do disband. But what I love about this is most of those bands were influenced to have that heavier rock by the Beatles, right?
Yep.
So, I mean, it's not a big stretch. And of course, Paul McCartney is famously a fan of Led Zeppelin.
Right.
It's not a stretch to see those bands being influenced by Helter Skelter, or even as simple as it may seem in retrospect, that kind of gurgling hard rock sound that's just beneath the surface on Sgt. Pepper. So, the Beatles were very much in tune with that. Their issue was they could do it all. So, you could have a song like I Want You, She's So Heavy. And then they could turn around and do something sweet and beautiful. And in a lot of ways, isn't that what we love about them? That's why I love the White Album. You're going along, you're hearing Blackbird, and then something else comes at you.
Yeah, exactly.
That's just what's amazing about that record, are the extremes, and the Beatles would work those extremes really, really well. Obviously, Abbey Road was originally meant for a two-sided long-playing album, but when you listen to it now, isn't it amazing effect when you go from I Want You, She's So Heavy, and that sudden silence, and then that beautiful guitar of Here Comes the Sun.
Yep, it was sequenced, and I'm sure we've talked about this before in various conferences, but today, of course, people are listening to music, younger people, differently, and downloading single tracks or so and this is a case where absolutely this was so purposefully organized and sequenced, because as you said, that is such a perfect and also at the end of the medley, of course, when we get the secret track at the end, they're coming out for just a little encore. And
Right.
after
I agree, but I do also think that's them puncturing the idea of ending. Nothing
Yeah.
ever really ends. My favorite little story is, just thinking quite literally about the album Revolver, right? And one of the meanings of that record is this idea of a record player spinning. And, I think quite literally, it's fair to say that after Revolver came out in 1966, it's never stopped spinning.
Yep, that is true.
So some of it's playing somewhere every minute of every day.
Yep, absolutely. Let's see. Okay, Mean Mr. Mayo, our cohort on Talk More Talk, said, asks, do you think there is room to doubt that the Fabs weren't getting along? So I think, was there any area where they maybe that, was it overblown as to how much they were, fighting, or do you think?
I think I do think that's a fair statement. I think when we look at the evidence, it's overblown to a certain extent in the studio. I think most of their relationships outside of the studio were starting to end and have been coming apart for a while. But I've always believed John Lennon when he said that there were no new fights toward the end of the Beatles. They were really the same arguments they were having back around Rubber Soul. Paul McCartney walks out when they're making She Said, She Said. So these weren't new. Creative differences, anybody who's been in a band or any kind of artistic fusion knows, are real. People really have these differences, and they are extreme. So those are very real things. I don't think they're overblown, though, when we look at the comments they made at the time. So they really did have trauma outside of making the great music they made with the Get Back project.
Yeah.
The day that, Yoko stole George Harrison's cookie, that's real, and it caused trauma. That was witnessed by many people. So those things are real. But then they would go downstairs that same day and record those amazing guitar solos. So what that tells us is one of the skills they had as a working unit was that they could go in, even in their darkest days, and wrest victory out of the jaws of defeat, to use that old baseball metaphor, right?
Yeah, that's right.
They did. That's what they do with the Let It Be album when it was Get Back. Terrible month, not getting a lot done. And the last 4 or 5 days of the month, they make 6 classic songs.
Yep, that's right.
That's an amazing thing to be able to do.
Yep, that is for sure. We've got a question from Rob Gertson. Hi, Rob. He wants to know what was the most sort of like kind of amazing, touching kind of moment during the research and writing. What was there something in particular that you discovered that just blew your mind? As you were researching and writing this.
Wow. We know so much already about the making of that album, but it's usually the same thing for me. The experience of writing about it from beginning to end, whatever the subject is. And I would say the same thing about my class. So as you know, I'm teaching the Beatles. It's not online, as somebody asked earlier.
Yeah.
It's in person on Monday nights. It's an amazing experience because you start with Please Please Me, and at the end of the semester, we will end with The End, or Her Majesty, I guess.
Yep.
But the point is, you get that amazing experience of watching them grow right before your eyes. And it's very powerful. And for me, watching them like great painters, painting the strokes and changing things. Paul was working until the very last hours of the album on You Never Give Me Your Money. He was never quite satisfied with the segue to Sun King. He was never happy with that B section with the piano. I'm always fascinated and moved by that, the way that artists make choices
Yeah.
particularly for obvious, well, not particularly, but obviously, for records like this one that are so important to so many people.
Yeah, exactly.
Because
Yeah,
the
and
choices are vital. So
mhm.
I know I'm probably not answering it very well, and I
No,
look forward to
no.
reading Rob's book someday because he's a great Beatles thinker.
Yes, he is.
I would be right. I'd be right first in line to buy that book. He's a
Me
really
too.
great thinker.
Mhm.
But it wasn't any one moment. It was the accumulation or the cumulative effect of every night when I would come home to write,
Mhm.
having feeling that album happening.
Mhm.
And it's very powerful. I mean, that's one of the reasons we come back to this great story,
Yep.
is to
Yeah.
experience that.
Yep. Now, did this, as sort of a follow up, of course, we recently had the 50th anniversary box set come out. So, was there, and I think Rob asked this question as well, is there anything that you thought, should have been included in that set that was left out, that you came across in your research, or, do you think there's everything's out there that should be out there? What do you think?
Well, they could have included the famous tape, I guess. Right? It's not a long
Yes.
conversation. That could have been on there.
Hmm.
More than that, I really was disappointed. One thing I wanted to hear, and I kind of learned early on, it wasn't going to be there, were
Hmm.
the guitar solos. They didn't
Yeah.
come out perfectly formed, like that some odd second bit that we know from the end.
Hmm.
They were not. They were mostly in that order. But the problem was they didn't have that kind of punch to them. And what
Right.
happened was Alan Parsons edited them down to give them that kind of catapult effect where one would end and the other would begin, right?
Yep.
And it's quite an amazing editing job. And I would have liked to have heard those a little bit more disembodied and disaggregated so we could have experienced that, because really it was a hell of an editing job that he did to make.
Yeah.
He really makes those solos happen. We can hear the blank space where they go
Yep.
in the one take of the end that they share with us. But I was
Mhm.
very disappointed in that. I love having the orchestral isolation, particularly the one for Something, which is gorgeous.
Yes.
Really, I've for that one. I will Come Together.
Hmm.
I hadn't spent time with that mix before. The one where we hear them, where John's working on the guide vocal.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And it was nice to have, the well-known piece from Ballad of John and Yoko, where they're talking to each other like George and Ringo, right? John and Paul. If I have a disappointment, it's one that I discovered after I reviewed the album
Hmm.
online,
Yeah.
and that is and I invite your good listeners and yourself, of course, to check this
Hmm.
out on
Yeah.
the remix that Giles and Sam O'Kell made for "I Want You, She's So Heavy." Unless I'm mistaken, and I don't think I am because I've tested it several times now,
Yep.
they have varnished off the moment in that last screen before the coda where the needle goes into the red when
Oh,
John
sure.
screams. And I noticed it when I was in my car, which has my best stereo.
Yep.
It has my best sound system. And
Sure.
I was listening and I thought, I'll be damned, it's gone. It's kind of
Wow.
been softened, or I don't even have the terminology to describe it, but check that out, folks, and see if you hear it too. And
Interesting.
I miss it. And I haven't had a chance to say this to Giles or anybody, but if you ask me, and nobody did, and
Mhm.
nobody should, um, but if you did, I would say that was integral to the song, because John speaks
Mhm.
movingly about how the song is a cry, it's an agony, right? And
Yeah.
that's that final blood-curdling scream before
Mhm.
that amazing coda starts and that Wagnerian ending
Yeah.
of side one, and certainly of that song. So I did feel like that was missing.
That's interesting. Yeah, and again, this could probably be a whole other book, but the choices that Giles made in the mixing and all. I mean, it's like, even for me, like Come Together, when that kind of moan he does at the John does at the end. It's now way down in the mix, which was a little bit of an adjustment for me too.
Right. And look, I Giles, if you're listening, and you should be listening to the queen of all Beatles media.
That's right.
But I've gotten great pleasure out of the remixes. I love the separation that he's created, that I think we can all say the Beatles would have appreciated. It separated their instruments. They're not as muddy. Right. So I value that very, very, very much. But the blemishes are few and far between.
Yeah, exactly.
I love when you open up the sound palette and a drum is not becoming part of a rhythm guitar or something.
Yep, absolutely. I mean, that is the great thing about these remixes that and of course, just what's great about the Beatles in general is you're always discovering something new. I mean, I'm always discovering, a new guitar line, or I mean, even with Come Together in the remix, you can hear them better saying "shoot me," which I hadn't really, noticed as it wasn't as prominent as it is now, and so things like that are just such fun to do. Oh, I was wondering if we'd get a visit from a cat, one of the cats. There you go. Yeah,
Gertie McDowell. She had to say hi.
Gertie. No, good. I was hoping we'd have a cat appearance. So. Well, we are almost out of time, so let me. I'll just mention, Margo Winnick, which we know her from the New York Fest. She said, "Loved hearing more of Billy Preston." I will second you on that, my friend. Absolutely, loved hearing more of him. That's for sure. So, as we know, there are a lot of Beatles books out there. There have been, a number of things already written about Abbey Road and about, all their different albums. So, what is it that you wanted to accomplish with Solid State? What did you want to add to the conversation?
Well, I really wanted to do exactly what the title says, and that is to bring the idea of the technology to the fore, to help explain why this album is different. And I also saw it as a metaphor, quite frankly, that some people, I know you got it because you're a great reader, Dr. Queen.
Yeah.
Ooh, and that is, thank you. I just came up with it.
Good.
And that is, the last line of the book. The Beatles created a solid state, which is my metaphor for the way they end their career is so integral to the fact that we're listening to them now, and they have such mystique and power. And they had created, really, by making that album and making it so well, a really firm, solid foundation for these 50 years since. If you think about it, they really did. If you had to say farewell, and they did, they really created a great going away party. And I just noticed Katie Jones offered a really smart, hey Earl, really a smart comment. And thank you, Aviv. A very smart comment there from Katie when she said, they still loved each other, and that's a fact. I mean, one of the in John Lennon's waning hours, when he's in that, when he's riding with the guys from RKO Radio to the record plant for his second to last ride, he was asked about that, and he said, "Well, I would do anything for them, and they would do anything for me." And that's the kind of emotional stuff that just tugs at me.
Yeah,
and Katie's absolutely right about that.
Absolutely, I agree. So, well, I'll tell you, we could spend easily another hour or so talking about this, because there is so much here, which is why, as I said, go check this out. And I'm not just saying this because Ken's a good friend of mine, but really, it's such a complicated story, and Ken does a wonderful job of bringing all of these pieces together, and the personal, the professional, the technological. It's just a full picture of this album. So Ken, before we go, why don't you tell everybody what's coming up for you? What are you working on? Where can people find you?
Well, I'm on Monday night. I will be in New York City at the Cornell Club. I feel like one of those comedians on Johnny Carson in the 70s. You can catch me at the Cornell Club.
Don't forget to tip your waitress.
Yeah, on Monday nights, right? So, yeah, I'm doing a lot of fun promotion. On Sunday, we're doing a Wonderwall production where we'll do a talk, and we'll be with the Magical Mystery Girls, and I believe they'll be playing the album,
cool,
in its entirety, which should be fun and not a mystery. So I'm always staying busy, always writing something new.
That's for sure. In fact, when we were at the conference, I was getting all these messages on my phone while we were sitting and saying, alerts for you, like, that you were in time, you were on, I forget. I mean, it was like, what? Like, oh my God, how does he do it?
Well, I'm, I think I have some kind of bibliomania.
Yeah.
So, hopefully there's a medication for it.
Yeah, exactly. That's a pretty serious condition. But anyway, and so I mean, you are just incredibly busy. But thank you so much for stopping by, because I just wanted to let everybody know about the book, and also that Ken will be back on Talk More Talk next year. As he mentioned, he's been teaching a course. And by the way, were these courses when I was in college? That's what I want to know.
I don't know. Look, it's at Monday night at 7:30. You could be there every week. I don't know where you are.
I just hop a plane, no problem.
Right. Well, there's a train too.
And a train. That's true. That is very true. But anyway, so thank you so much, Ken, for coming and talking to our listeners, and you guys. A couple of people asked, how do you get it? You can get it on Amazon, I assume. Is that the best way, or is
that is the fastest way? Certainly.
Yep.
Thanks to Jeff Bezos, right?
Yes.
Hey, Jason.
Well, yeah, exactly. And we'll be at the March Fest for Beatles fans. I'm sure, so you'll be signing books there. So they, you can bring your copy, and
that's right. We'll be sharing our table as always.
Absolutely, and causing lots of trouble. So it'll be great. So thank you, everybody, for tuning in. I will see you next month. As Ringo says, peace and love. See you guys soon. Bye-bye.